Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, Black Mental Health, a Systemic Approach. My name is Tiana Smith and today we will be discussing trauma. Now, trauma is very subjective. Trauma is used to describe experiences where emotional responses were too big to process. More often than not, these types of events happen chronically, and usually this is where we as people develop coping mechanisms and behaviors to survive. Technically, we become disconnected from ourselves, ultimately disconnecting us from others. We repeat what we know from people who repeated what they knew. Okay, so that is, in a nutshell, what trauma is. Examples of trauma in any phase of life could be a car accident, a family member passing away, or witnessing a violent crime. Those are all examples of trauma that can happen at any phase in life. Trauma in childhood could look like having your reality denied, being raised by someone who cannot regulate their emotions in a positive manner, and not being seen or heard, having parents who are focused more on appearance, and directly or indirectly being told that you can't or shouldn't experience certain emotions. So in our community, in the Black community, we know that Black men are less than vulnerable, right? So we take a look at where that comes from, and we have understood it to be less than powerful for a Black man to cry, show his emotions, ask for help, or do things that would ultimately make him vulnerable. It's all connected. Trauma in childhood is not just limited to the perception of abuse and neglect. Unresolved trauma causes people to engage in patterns, particularly in a way, as a way to survive. Now you might say, well, how do people process trauma? How do I know if I have trauma or not? How would I know that, right? So becoming aware of your trauma and the ability to process an event, which would be your trauma, depends on your ability to identify, feel, and release an emotional experience, which is also considered your conditioned emotional resilience. The amount of modeling and support you receive from a parent or both your parents or a caregiver, whatever your setting was as a child, based on their own ability to self-regulate. So if your parent could not self-regulate, 9 times out of 10 you have learned that, and now you are that child who has learned how not to self-regulate. Now you are that adult who has manifested that trauma into your adulthood. Another factor that impacts how people process their trauma is pattern responses that are developed from your earliest experiences. Unconsciously, those become habits. So whatever you did as a child to deal with your trauma have become unconscious habits that you continue to deal with and you continue to do as you become an adult. And for some, that's why you say you have this 27-year-old man who acts like he's 15 because he is used to the patterns that served him when the trauma that he went through was very fresh. He has not learned new ways of coping with that old wound, and so he continues to process that wound as a 15-year-old, and that's why we see things like that. I want you to understand that most people don't understand their behavior. When you're telling someone you're doing this is destructive, you're engaging in this self-destructive behavior, people assume because nothing too big has happened, they can't pinpoint and say, well, I was never in a car accident, or I was never molested, or I was never a victim of a crime. I never saw a crime. That doesn't necessarily have to be true for it to be trauma. And so because we have this assumption that something big has not happened, and that your actions cannot possibly be a result of something small, such as not being seen or heard, now you have this unresolved trauma. And so what I want us to get to as a culture is identifying that unresolved trauma, being able to process that trauma, and coming up with new ways of coping to process the trauma that will manifest itself in our adult lives. We want to get to a point where we understand our trauma, so much so to the point where we are able to explain to our children how to heal, and we're able to help our children heal. This is Tiana Smith, Black Mental Health, a Systemic Approach. Subscribe to my channel. I will see you guys the next segment. We will begin talking about other forms of trauma, how we can begin to start doing the work, and what doing the work looks like.